All right, welcome everybody. We have quite a few people registered, and so we'll give it a couple minutes. It's only a minute in. This is Mark, the Vice Chair of LGSEC, and as people seem to stop trickling in, we'll start with introductions. So in the meantime, we'll just give it a couple minutes. All right, once again, we're just continuing to admit people. We had about 200 people registered, and we probably expect about half of that to show up. That's usually how webinars go. So once we get a little closer to 100, or maybe just in another minute, we'll get started because there's a lot of content. All right, well, it looks like we're just about halfway to what we expected. So we'll get started. It's 3 minutes in, so thank you for everybody that signed up and joined and put your questions in ahead of time. This is Mark Costa, Vice Chair of the Local Government Sustainable Energy Coalition, and we are really excited to have this webinar with the City of Gonzales and a couple of their partners, and a big thanks to the LGSEC staff for helping organize this. So just about LGSEC, we are, as of now, a California-based nonprofit in California, really focused on all things energy and really empowering local governments. Over the years, we've built the blueprint for local government partnerships and regional energy networks, and have played a role in community choice aggregators. And so everything that empowers local governments to really take control over the future of their energy. And we've done a tremendous amount of work in the regulatory space as well, across a lot of different proceedings, most notably energy efficiency. And over the course of the last couple of years on the microgrid proceeding, where even we got some earned media from our regulatory comments in terms of our work in that space, really connecting the dots between local governments and the proceedings. And what really embodies some of those comments and the flavors of the day in terms of what's going on with regulatory, it's all embodied in what the city has done that we'll be hearing about today. And so just as a reminder, if you're not a member, we highly encourage you to become a member. It really, will help expand our regulatory presence and resources to be able to serve everyone, especially now, with such stimulus coming both at the state and federal level. And we do represent local governments across all commissions that you see there on the screen, the CPUC, CEC, and CARB. And with that, I think that we should get started. So let's go into it. The format for today, I'm going to briefly just introduce by name our three speakers. They'll give a self-introduction, and then Dustin will be kind of behind the wheel here, leading us through the presentation. That will take about 35 minutes or so, and we'll save 20 minutes for Q&A. So what would be very helpful, if you do have a question, please use the chat box and send it to, if you're comfortable, to everybody, but really the host and presenter would be very beneficial, so that we can digest the questions and hold them towards the end. and then we'll try and pick the themes and direct the questions to one of our three speakers. And just acknowledge that, if there's commission staff or other cities on, you're very much welcome to have you here. And with that, we'll get started. So first of all, I'm going to pass it to René. Do you want to give a quick introduction?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Mark. René Mendez, City Manager, City of Gonzales. Been here for about 15 years. Before I was with county, I was county administrator for about 10 and came out of the ledger analyst office. So great meeting everybody.
Great. And Dustin?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and hi, everyone. Dustin Jolley here with OurEnergy. I'm a civil engineer. I've been in the industry for about 20 years, expert and specialist in the renewable energy space, and in particular with renewable energy power systems and microgrids. And we've been supporting the city in the full development of this project in the City of Gonzales that we'll be talking about today. So really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Great. And then Brian.
Hey, I'm Brian Curtis, founder of Concentric Power. We're about 11 years old now. We've been developing microgrid projects, mostly in the ag sector and mostly in California. And we're excited to be working with the City of Gonzales on this one.
Okay, perfect. So Dustin, I'm going to turn it over to you and go on mute, and let's take it from here. And it looks like we're teetering around 100 participants. So that's a very good sign.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, let's jump right into it. So just quick clarification. Are you going to be advancing the slides, or should I be doing that directly?
I believe Serena will.
Great. Thanks, Serena. Okay. So, well, the theme of the discussion today is local governments and powering energy solutions. And in particular, we're going to be talking about community microgrids with a focus on the project here in the City of Gonzales. So you can move on, Serena. Thanks. So I just wanted to spend a couple minutes here up front. I know that the community here is probably pretty well informed about what is a microgrid at this point, but let's just cover this briefly. So a microgrid, in brief, the DOE's definition there is there for all of your use, but essentially it's a network of interconnected loads and generation sources that can be operated autonomously from the macro grid or in conjunction with the macro grid. And this is kind of a cool diagram that was originally produced through a collaboration between NREL and EPRI that shows kind of an interesting nuance here. I know the term microgrid can be a little bit ambiguous because a microgrid can take many different shapes. So with the yellow, green, and sort of pink colored blobs here, that sort of illustrates the different levels that a microgrid could potentially operate at, from the distribution and substation level down to the individual feeder level, and even all the way down to individual facilities. And the interesting thing about microgrids as well is that they can also be nested within one another, as is somewhat illustrated in this figure. So for example, a feeder level microgrid could be like the community microgrid that we're going to be talking about today in more depth in Gonzales. You could also, of course, have microgrids that power individual critical facilities like public safety or fire, or of course, business or residential. Go ahead, Serena, thanks. So in addition to the different sizes of microgrids, not all microgrids are alike, and they can come in various levels of complexity and sophistication, from a more simplistic type of arrangement that is simply able to island, say, an individual load, all the way down to moving towards the center of this diagram, which could have multiple generation sources, multiple customers, and the capability to interact in a sophisticated way with the macro grid. Next slide, please. So why might we develop a microgrid, and when might that be appropriate? The primary driver for microgrid projects these days is energy resilience, and I think that's a topic of a lot of discussion and probably more awareness amongst the general population than there ever has been before, given all the public safety power shutoffs and the aging nature and increasing or decreasing reliability of the grid in general that's affecting all of us. But it also can enhance participation by various different levels in the community and be a money-saving measure, and of course facilitate a higher adoption of renewable energy. Beyond that, they can be a powerful tool for local economic development, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today. Ensuring clean energy resilience to the local business community and the community at large drives economic development by preserving business and day-to-day operational continuity in the face of some of these disruptions. And use case matters. A remote facility might require a different solution than a critical community facility, such as a public health or safety or fire type of use, versus perhaps a larger scale multi-customer arrangement, such as the one that we're going to talk about today in Gonzales. And while microgrids are a new tool for us, the macrogrid is still relevant. And the business models, of course, though, are changing, and the utilities that own and operate those are also taking different forms and changing their business models. Importantly, no project like the ones that we're talking about today can exist without a champion and visionary leadership. And with that said, I wanted to hand it over to René. And René, if you would please just take a couple minutes to give us the history and the why that has led to this undertaking in Gonzales. That would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Are we staying on this slide or the next one?
We'll stick here for now.
Okay, so Brian hit a lot on the why. For us, it was started with infrastructure, cities, municipalities, sewer, water, streets, but energy and being able to power not only our own use, but our businesses has become much more of a challenge in moving forward. We had an issue here where where Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E, is our provider. And we were looking at 3, 5, 6, 7 year lead times to get any major services set up, which is not doable. So we initially started with how do we improve that infrastructure? We've been at this for about 12 years. So that was one. Quickly, these turbines that you see here are an illustration. Each one of those turbines feeds one of our businesses. So one Taylor Farms, the other one Del Monte. And we quickly saw how that can help us meet our climate action plan goals, green, and we have a sustainability policy here in town. So we started with all of that. And it's quickly led to generating some jobs and economic development. So not only are we trying to be as environmentally conscious as possible, but we're also trying to create jobs that our communities need. So that at the bottom line, that's what it was. It was, why did we do this? Well, we saw it as something that we had to do, much like we have to do sewer and water and other things. So I know there'll be more slides along the way that'll get more in depth on that.
That's perfect. Thanks a lot, René. Srini, you could go to the next slide and I'll jump back in here. So community energy, not to get too philosophical here, but we recognize that our local leaders are thinking about solutions that can be as diverse as our communities and facilitate equity. While we can create structures for everyone to participate at every economic level, some will always simply be consumers. And this is not a fault, it's just simply a fact of society. But even at a basic consumer level, everyone should have access and the opportunity to participate at whatever level they choose. And the rules of the game should allow all those who choose to participate to have the opportunity to do so equally. So on the topic of resilience, many with the means are tempted to defect from participation in the grid and go off grid. Technology certainly allows that these days. In some cases it's appropriate, but who does that benefit? Does this enhance community resilience? How does this translate to the democratization and energy in the sharing economy? Next slide, please. So let's have a look at a couple of community energy models. We've recently had this discussion before and declared a huge victory, as Mark mentioned at the introduction, with the establishment of the CCA legislation in California, that's community choice aggregation. So 15 years in or so now, CCAs are here and proliferating. As of today, about 45% of PG&E's load has been absorbed by CCAs. So the business model of the incumbent utilities is most certainly changing. The CCA legislation created an incredible opportunity for local governments and local governmental entities to disrupt the choice of generation investments and associated revenue streams with the charter of using those monies for local economic development. Some are carrying generation portfolios that are very near or completely carbon free, which is progress. While there has been varying business models implemented overall, the established CCAs have seen quite a bit of success, and several are now carrying very strong credit ratings and large balances and strong reserves. We've only just barely started to realize the economic potential in programs and innovations and other community benefits that these providers can implement. So are we all finished then? Shall we just wait to see what these agencies roll out? Of course, there is opportunity for all of us to be engaged if we are a participating customer in one of these CCA territories to have our voice heard. Revisiting the concept of the optimal solution or the sweet spot among the range of options here, we believe we've hit on something here in the City of Gonzales at the municipal level. What's the best definition of a community and as it comes to energy and programs that are appropriate for the community? Are the same programs in Santa Cruz the best fit for the community in Gonzales? I would argue probably not. And this is one of the challenges with expanding utility territory. It's very tough for programs and policies to be implemented when the geographies that they serve are so diverse. It may seem at first that the municipal utility and CCA models are competing or disruptive to one another, and in some respects they are, but we believe there's room for both. Should essential services and infrastructure be run by government or should they be privatized? I know that there's a heated debate about that and a lot of opinions on both sides. Again, there might be a sweet spot where there's room for both. Next slide, please. So this just begins to illustrate some of the pathways that a community microgrid facilitates and some of the throughputs. Again, we believe that there's a hybrid model that moves ever closer to the optimal solution, and a local government public utility purpose-built to serve its local community can be one of those. A regional body such as a CCA with strong financial wherewithal to support those utilities could play a powerful role there. And likewise, an innovative private sector with access to private capital and capable of providing nimble and expert services also has a very important role here. Next slide, please. So just quickly, there's a couple of different examples that we can get into, and then we're gonna spend the most of our time talking about the Gonzales project specifically. A tribal government has its own unique scenario and unique opportunities with respect to being a community energy provider. This is one quick example that OurEnergy has been working on with the San Pasqual Band of Mission Indians down in Southern California. This is a rather small project and takes advantage of the fact that a lot of these community facilities are closely located near each other. And ultimately, this version of a community microgrid will be fully owned by the tribal government and will provide resilient energy to the tribal administrative offices and community center, the police, fire, wastewater treatment, and daycare and childcare facilities. Next slide, please. Okay, so this brings us to the Gonzales project. The Gonzales project is a much more complex microgrid project. As we'll talk about here in a moment, it involves the raising and operations of a publicly owned utility. It has some complex partnerships, both in the private sector and with other agencies and utilities. And with that, Brian, I think I'm going to kick it over to you here for a minute if you wanted to go through some of the aspects of the project.
Sure, great. Thanks, Dustin. And thanks everybody for putting this on today. Yeah, so basically what you're looking at on the screen here is a satellite image of the City of Gonzales, just to provide a little bit of context for some that might not be familiar with the city. It's a population of 8,000 or 9,000 people, and the main economic driver for the city is the ag industrial park, which is what the microgrid will be serving. So what you're seeing there on the upper right side is where the industrial, which are largely agricultural processing facilities, are located. And then down on the bottom left is where the wastewater treatment plant is, and I'll get to that in a second on why that's relevant. But basically, at the end of the day, with the key goals of the project being promoting economic development, reducing costs for the end users, and increasing reliability in the face of power outages and other power quality problems that you often see in rural areas. We basically put together a project here that includes all of the above goals. And the way we do that is through several different aspects. There's solar, which is the bulk of the energy that will be delivered. About 80% of the energy will be delivered by solar. That'll be supported by batteries, and then further supported by natural gas generation. What's kind of interesting from an energy perspective on this, like an engineering perspective, is as costs for the renewables, namely solar and then batteries in support of that, have come way down, all of a sudden you find yourself with configurations that previously didn't pencil. And so what we're able to do is actually deliver much higher levels of renewables because of that. So that definitely plays out in this project. The other thing I would say as part of this project is the controls and automation and ability to dispatch, as it would be called in the power industry, those different assets at different times, depending on the situation, whether it's a day like today in Gonzales where it's windy and sunny, it's going to have a different outcome than when it's middle of the winter and middle of the night. So the system has the ability to control all of those things. The other thing to mention is part of the scope of the work here is to build a new substation. And the idea behind that was, in order to facilitate growth of the industrial park, the existing substation from PG&E was not sufficient to support that growth. And the path of least resistance to getting that infrastructure built was to, from the city's perspective, build it themselves. So that's part of the project as well. So I'll pause there and go to the next slide, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Actually, Serena, before you move on to the next slide, let's hang here for a second. I just wanted to cover a couple other elements. That was great, Brian. Thanks. And I'm going to take a couple of the next slides, and I'll hand it back over to you again to go even deeper into detail here on some of the design configuration. But I just wanted to mention that this is a large capital project undertaken by the city. It's also being coordinated with an expansion of their wastewater treatment facilities. So there's some advantages being taken there of co-locating some facilities, which is an interesting aspect of this. And also, we've got our eye on the future here in terms of ultimately going to a zero carbon energy mix, and through the utilization of biogas and landfill gas. And also has some unique elements for coordinated growth, because again, this as an economic development driver is really purpose built to facilitate the expansion of the industrial park, which has a significant amount of growth potential. So that's baked into the process here to be able to facilitate that smoothly. One other really interesting aspect of this new publicly owned utility, it's one of the only, if not the only in California, public utility agency, CCA or municipality, that ultimately will be a net energy exporter. The vast majority of other public utility authorities in the state are actually importers of energy over the macrogrid network from remote projects. And so the fact that this will be a net energy exporter and have all of the generating resources on site within its territory is a unique aspect. So with that, why don't we move on, Serena? Okay, so a quick slide here just on the timeline of the development process. I know that a lot of the stakeholders here on this call are interested in the process that the city has undertaken to accomplish this effort. It's been supported by a diverse team of legal and other technical professionals, and dates back to really in earnest when we started was in mid 2017 timeframe, although René, I think, has had this project on his mind even predating that. And And I'm not sure that he went into some of that detail on the earlier history, but I know that the City of Gonzales has had prior efforts in potentially starting a municipal electric authority, and also various other on-site generation projects that they've successfully undertaken. So in 2017, we took up this project in earnest and ran a pretty painstaking feasibility and alternatives analysis process. 2018, 2019, we wrapped that up. And during 2018, a key initial part of the process was for the city to form its own municipal electric utility. There was some comparison and contrast of potentially forming a municipal level CCA. They were already participating in the local CCA, now known as 3CE. And there's some collaborative potential there. So ultimately, we landed on raising the municipal electric utility to facilitate this project for certain reasons, which we could potentially go into during the Q&A. Around 2019, we ran a competitive process to invite prospective partners to the project. Concentric Power was ultimately selected as that partner, and together we've been working since then to raise this effort. In 2020 was pretty much spent negotiating the wholesale energy services agreement between Concentric Power and its project entity, Bodega Microgrid, and the utility. And here in 2021, we're currently in the process of customer onboarding and design and permitting activities, basically all the startup activities, and we're anticipating going live in 2022. Next slide, please. Okay, so a quick element of the commercial contract structure on the project. So there's a wholesale and retail arrangement with the municipal electric utility playing its role in the middle as the load serving entity. So there is a wholesale generation and services contract, energy services agreement between Concentric's Bodega Microgrid and the electric authority. And then the electric authority, through its municipal utility enterprise, will be the one providing retail service to the customers in the industrial park. And I should mention that this project is purpose-built for the industrial park. To start, it will not have any residential customers in its initial phases. It's really confined simply to the industrial park area and purpose-built to facilitate that growth, at least in the initial phases, as I mentioned. So next slide, please. Okay, so a couple of stats on the project. Ultimately, we landed on a wholesale rate to the utility of about 11.75 cents per kilowatt hour, with some metrics around that. And the utility, of course, has its own process of examining rates going forward and rate setting, which initially we're in the process of right now. As Brian mentioned at the beginning, the system is sized for somewhere around 35 gigawatt hours per year in terms of throughput. And Brian mentioned, I think, some of the assets, and he's going to go into some more depth on that here in just a moment. And then the ownership structure is important as well. So it is a shared ownership structure. It's not a public-private partnership in the traditional sense. However, it is a partnership more broadly in that some of the key assets will be owned and operated by the private partner, and other key assets, particularly the distribution network within the microgrid, will be owned by the municipal utility. And ultimately, there will also be some service agreements between the utility and Bodega and potentially others. Next slide, please. All right, Brian, so why don't I kick it back over to you, and you can provide a little bit more depth on the project arrangement here.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you for that. So what you're looking at here is an aerial view of the city. So kind of a reverse angle of the satellite we were looking at a little bit ago. And what's included here from this view is the firm power, which is the powerhouse, which includes the natural gas and the battery system, as well as the substation. And then the blue lines throughout the park is the distribution loop. Again, the natural gas here is playing a secondary role to the solar and the batteries. So the bulk of the firm power, which is to put it in energy industry speak, the dispatchable power, is going to be supported by the batteries, and then the gas engines beyond that. And then, as Dustin alluded to, in subsequent phases of the project, our plan is to introduce renewable fuels, potentially in the form of landfill gas. You can see up off in the distance in the right is Johnson Canyon landfill. There's also potential in a couple different ways to incorporate biogas. So really the goal is to have a pathway to get to 100% renewable, but we're starting at day one at roughly 80% of the power will be solar, which is a segue to the next slide. So the next slide, this is a reverse angle again. This is, you can see the two wind turbines in the distance that mark where the industrial park is. But this is the wastewater treatment plant, and you can see the existing ponds there today. As was already mentioned, this is being expanded as well to also serve the industrial park and the residential growth that's happening. And the idea here is to co-locate the solar with the wastewater treatment plant so that you're not taking valuable prime ag land out of service to provide the power that's needed. So this was an elegant way to do that. I would say what's been really interesting just in the last 2 years as this project has really gained momentum is the cost of solar and batteries as well, but solar in particular has come way down to the point where you can actually do some stuff like this that might not have really penciled in years past. So that's, I think, a good indicator, not just for this project, but projects in general. Things that might not have been possible before now are possible because of the cost structure. So that's actually a really good advancement in general. So that's been a good tailwind for the project, and I would say for the industry overall. So next slide.
Thanks, Brian. So why don't I jump back in here real quick, and we're just about there. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the project risks and considerations and how we address those. This is by a pretty significant margin the city's largest ever capital project at a phase one price tag of around $70 million. As we talked about before, there's a shared investment with about 85% being borne by the private partner in the Concentric team. That's mainly for the generating assets again, and then somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million for the distribution assets and the city's portion to take up its element. One really important aspect of this project is that, by comparison to the city's balance sheet, it's quite a large bite to take. So the way that we are structuring this from a financial perspective is being essentially underwritten by the project's revenues and is not being backed by the city's general fund, or therefore putting that general fund at risk. Likewise, there's a relatively small amount of very large initial customers. So customer volatility and acquisition is very important to raising, especially this first phase of the project and gaining that critical mass. So we've been working hard on that as a team to make that happen. And last but not least, we all know that there's a lot of state regulatory changes underway. There's the Microgrids OIR that's in process that we're all watching very closely. And generally we see that, someone has to go first. This is a first of its kind project in the state. And it's been quite an adventure to get it raised. In the future, we anticipate that, through market development, it's going to move more towards streamlined and standardized solutions, and hopefully those to follow will have a much more straightforward process to implement such an endeavor. Next slide, please. Great. So with that, we wanted to close with some of the project benefits, and if you would, Renee, maybe just jump back in and bring us on home here.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I'm seeing a lot of great questions on the chat. So just, I'd like to get to those maybe and some of the other sent in questions. But project benefits, we adopted a sustainability initiative 12 years ago. And we kind of really didn't know what that meant at the time. We had some general inclination, but and we started a sort of accumulating, I guess, if you will, assets or ideas, for lack of a better way of putting it. And I think that's one of the things I would advise everybody. Sometimes it's important to just kind of start, feels right, just start accumulating them. Councils might not want to go in that direction, or your leadership, but I think it's important to really inform yourselves. Bottom line, project benefit is, I think at the end of the day, it's low, clean, low cost electric power. We've solarized all our city facilities. So this was sort of the next step for us. It will expand our industrial park. In 10 years, we've added over 1,500 jobs, which is significant when you consider our community is only 9,000 people. It will provide reliable electrical power. We did suffer power safety shutoff for 2 days, which 2 days might not seem like a whole lot, but it does when you have companies that are bringing in 1,000 employees in a 24-hour period, and just all the other things that occur not only through the residential but the industrial sectors and our business sectors. So we lived it, and the uncertainty around this process has really brought this home. It's like, we'll get the notice that it might happen. So how do you plan for being shut down when you don't know if you are or not? So it does. There's some questions around PG&E. We are working with them. Frankly, at this point, I think Dustin did share they're in a different, their market is changing, and their business model is changing. And I think that gives municipalities a lot of impetus. I don't want to use somewhat leverage to really push some of these efforts forward. And it will, over time, create a funding source for us to reinvest in our community. And frankly, it's helping us meet our climate action plans and our carbon footprint goals and other things that we're all required to meet. So bottom line, I think it's trying to do the right thing, but with a direct benefit to our local communities, which is sometimes lost in larger efforts like CCAs and so forth, right? They're very important, but sometimes the resident in your communities don't really see the benefits. So I think we're doing it for those reasons. And I'll be happy to sort of share some of the questions, some of the lessons learned and things that I think we could have done better or different, and so costs and so forth. So with that, Brian, I'll throw it back. Dustin, I'll throw it back to you.
I think we're good. Mark, I think it's over to you at this point. Thanks, Renee.
Great. Yeah, really good presentation, and we still have maintained our audience, so that's always a good thing. So we have a ton of questions, and we can follow up the email and writing if we don't get to all of them, but I'll kick it off with one question. So Renee, really good point. City of Gonzales is just under 9,000 residents and 1.9 square miles. And so this is really a David versus Goliath when it comes to taking on this responsibility. And this question might encapsulate a few different ones that we can drill into. But if you were maybe a private developer that owned maybe the industrial business park or something like that, could you have been able to do this under the current rules in the state? Or was it because that you're a municipality that you needed to take some unique action? And
I think it's because we're a municipality. I've talked to Dustin and Brian a lot about really what do cities have left? What do communities have left, right? What is it that we can bring to the table? We all try to increase our retail base. We all try to increase depending on where you're at. What other sources of revenues can you raise? We're very constrained as it comes to fees and taxes, not the way it used to be 30 years ago, right? It's a lot more challenging these days. So I think in essence, we created a market opportunity by forming a utility, and like Dustin said, been able to give a pathway for a company like Concentric to create the energy service that we're going to sell. So we're going to sell across lot lines. We're going to sell to multiple users. as a utility. So I think what we encapsulated and captured, because we couldn't do the project ourselves, our budget by comparison, when we're doing capital projects, is $20 million a year, all funds. So when you look at something like this, we really need outside investment. And so I think our municipal structure, the fact that we went through and created our utility, which by the way, to this point has been the most expensive part of this project, with all the legal requirements that we had to put in place, and all the legal horsepower that we needed. You just established a market opportunity. So under the regulatory environment, and I know Dustin can speak a little bit more to this, or Brian, it's really allowed a company like Concentric to be innovative and to have a pathway for their investment. So Dustin, I don't know if you want to add a little more to that.
No, I think that was great, Renee. If there's a follow-up question, I'm sure we can address it, but I think that was perfect.
Great. Okay. Let's hit a couple of the questions that people asked when they registered. I'll throw maybe a couple out. So one is, how do you value resilience? So we know that's an ongoing regulatory issue. There's public ways to evaluate that. The national labs have some stuff around that. And the private sector also has that. So how on the ground, how do you value resilience?
Well, Mark, maybe I'll jump in. So, this methodology of valuing resilience as sort of an externality that's maybe a trickier thing to put dollars and cents on in a project economic analysis is one that's been taken up, as you mentioned, by the academic and private sector and others as the community energy and microgrid space has matured. And I think we covered it, on this particular project. The value of resilience was quite clear with respect to the value of the business community and its presence in terms of local jobs and economic development and tax revenues to the city, and all of those other elements as essentially the economic engine to the city. So being able to offer resilience to, first and foremost to that business community, at least in this first phase of the project, to be able to shore that up is really where much of the value is derived. Of course, there's various other aspects of valuing resilience in terms of public access to critical facilities and various other things like that. But really, the primary in this case was to the business community and business continuity.
Great. Okay.
And if I could add on just from a different perspective. And this would be sort of an on the ground, like boots on the ground, real world perspective is, unfortunately, I was gonna say for better or for worse, but mostly for worse, there's actually a lot of real data now to the extent that there's been power outages in the last couple of years with the power safety or public safety power shutoffs, PSPS events. And so when we talk to customers in the park here, but really as we talk to customers across the state, they've got real numbers now where they're saying, okay, well, the PG&E shut us off for 2 days. So we had to send people home. We had our refrigerated facility got warm. We had to cool it back down. We had perishable product that spoiled. We had to delay shipment. Like they've got a long list of actual costs that they now have. And so they're starting to quantify it really specifically and doing the math themselves on, okay, well, if that's going to happen, we need to invest in backup generators, for example, and that will justify itself with just one event. And so they've got those numbers generally. The next level question, though, is can you actually put those numbers to use in your assessment of whether you should sign up for a microgrid, whether it's as part of a community or on your own, and really put some numbers to it and actually value it. And again, the real world is kicked in here in California where these power outages are happening and they're real. So people really are starting to put those numbers against projects as part of the value. So I think that's part of the reality today is those numbers are out there and people know what it costs when the power goes out for a long time.
Great. It would be nice if those customers can get compensated or claim an 8%, return on investment for their lost business activities, but utilities. And so based on moving on from that question is, what was the process to, and this was in the chat and before, what was the process to either take over or build? I think you said you had to build a substation or were involved in that. And was there any distribution system or transmission level infrastructure you had to get involved in? And how did that go? And what's the current relationship with PG&E?
So let me kick that off. So the current relationship. So we haven't built our substation yet. So we're kicking off that process. But the current relationship with PG&E is because we created our own utility with this own board, which happens to be our council and so forth. We're talking to them utility to utility, which is there's a nuance there that actually helps as opposed to a city as a customer to PG&E. So that's allowed us to have much more robust conversations about, frankly, do we use portions of their distribution system? Do we pay it? I'm going to simplify it. Do we lease it? Do we add on to their distribution system? Do we build a separate distribution system? We're at the point right now where we're negotiating we're working on a first ever with PG&E MOA to deal with this project. So it's requiring them to look at their different systems, and they are working like a lot of investor-owned utilities. They are working with the PUC on a microgrid process, right? So right now we are actually in negotiation with PG&E on how are we going to work together in partnership? Is there a pathway forward? If there's not, then there's not. And we're going to be behind the meter and island off and eventually connect to what Dustin has said, the macro grid. But I will tell you that going to date myself, but in 25, 30 years plus of doing this, the conversation with PG&E today is significantly different than it was 5 years ago. And it's remarkably different than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. They weren't really, we had to address them the way they wanted to be addressed. That's not the case anymore. And I think there's a lot of value in communities. I see some chats. I think communities have to have the right mix. We're not all the same, but there's a lot of value in communities really assessing if a microgrid works for them and really exploring different ways of doing it, and then having the conversation with utility, because now you're coming in from a different perspective. So to me, to us, the relationship with PG&E is, I think we're going to end up with an MOU that gives us a pathway forward, or how we're going to collaborate with each other, utility to utility.
Great. And so on, speaking of conversations, so there's the ones that you had with utilities and all your stakeholders. How did the community receive this, and what are the benefits for the residents? I know it's a phased approach. And do you anticipate launching programs in addition to moving power?
Yes, and I think I didn't budget the question about resiliency. We're finishing or hopefully getting out of a pandemic, right? And we've talked a lot about resiliency of our communities and how they've kind of got through this with us and so forth, all the challenges, all the different things that we've all had to do. But resiliency at the community level is, how does these projects help them put food on the table? How does these projects help, give me a pathway for a better quality of life in our community and so forth? And those are the things that I think are not highlighted as much. So the conversation with community has been exactly that, is, this creates jobs. What kind of jobs? Cooling, refrigeration, but there's a lot of technical jobs. For example, Concentric Power, they're going to be building their facility in one of the facilities here. It's going to create, bring 40 plus great paying jobs to the community. So I think that's when you begin to see the benefit of these projects. We're eyes wide open. It's, we've gone to the council, we've totally represented what this cost is. We need the end user to pay for this project, and we're going to invest it in our community with, maybe community solar. Now we start talking about those types of things where we have potentially a process, a method, and a funding source to do that, and not just push all those costs to our community. So that's where we're having those conversations, and our community to this date is responding well. Questions, And don't be afraid to duck the question, and don't be afraid to, you know, provide the risks that are involved.
Great. We still have about 10 minutes left. And so I've seen a couple, a ton of questions come in, but, I think a lot of people want to take action, right? They're motivated. They've seen this. A lot of local government stakeholders are on the call, as well as private sector folks and all the like. And so what would you say is, and this question is for all presenters, what's the common denominator that you've recognized or that you can maybe think of that having gone through this process, whether you're a dense urban area, and I know the answer is going to depend, but is there a common denominator on what a municipality can do to go down this path or something similar? And whether that's something in terms of finding a champion, engaging your community, raising capital. I mean, what would that common denominator be?
Good question.
And if not, what's the low-hanging fruit that you would recommend any city to do?
To have a conversation, well, I think the low-hanging fruit is when we start talking about, carbon footprint resiliency, kind of controlling your own, or having a better input or ability to control your own destiny moving forward, is what does that mean for your community? What is it that your council sort of is looking as a value, or your board, or whatever that happens to be? And I think it's important to start with that. For us, it was frankly a quality of life. I would tell you that 15 years ago, I did one of these strategic sessions with the council where they all drew, I asked them to draw how they saw their community in 10, 15 years, right? And I had just come from a conference, and that's what I did. So I thought, I'm going to ask the council to do it. So they did it, and it was remarkable how it all aligned. And when you started really addressing what that meant, and I think you have to start there. And I get it, councils are different. People have different priorities, their values, and we're all different to that extent. But I think if you're able to get that and engage your community in that visioning, I think some of the low-hanging fruits really become visible. And I know it's not a real specific answer, a direct answer, but it's as simple as that. And I jokingly tease one of these turbines that you saw. Yeah, I was like, okay, we're done. We made our climate action plan for the next 10 years just with that, because of the size of our community, right? But I teased about that, but there is some power in that. There are some low-hanging fruit projects that we could all do and just message those. And and I think people then begin to jump on board. Okay, there's a pathway forward. And I don't know, I'd be interested from Brian's perspective as a private sector, kind of what does he see as a low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, I think I'll talk to the low-hanging fruit, but I thought it was a really interesting and good question on what are the common denominators that are pushing projects forward. And I think some of it, I got to say, this one being kind of the first of its kind has taken a lot of commitment and conviction, not just from the city and all the folks like us at Concentric, but the customers as well, and knowing that there's a better future. It sounds kind of hokey when you say it, but I think what we're starting to see as we do work around the state is, now that there's a couple of examples out there, it's getting easier to point to examples. And it's not just, hey, I don't want to be the first guy to stick my neck out. That's part of it, but it's also really nuts and bolts stuff. Like, for example, contracts and contract terms that law firms are familiar with, or regulatory things that have been beaten up already, and things that took us a year to negotiate. Now they exist. The next one might not be exactly the same, but I think it makes it a lot easier to not feel like you're sticking your neck out on the next one. So I think that conviction, and just knowing that there's if you look at it a little bit differently, there's solutions out there that get you where you want to be. So those are some of the common denominator things that I'm seeing in projects that are moving forward. And I think it starts to break down the barriers pretty darn quickly, actually, as projects, sort of first of its kind projects get done and built. In terms of low-hanging fruit, I think it's kind of the classic, you got to take a first step somewhere. And, Renee talked about, getting a couple wind turbines in the park. If you look at the industrial park here, and this is to the credit of the end users, the actual industrial owners in the park, is there's a lot of self-generation there already in the form of wind, solar, cogeneration, energy efficiency projects that have already happened. And what I'm seeing again around the state is there's a lot of that has already happened. And so it's kind of a natural next step once all that low-hanging fruit has been harvested, so to speak, to start to put together a bigger sort of system-wide type approach. So I think that's how I would look at it anyways.
Great. Okay. So with 3 minutes left, maybe we can ask one last question, and then I'll just wrap it up. But somebody asked a question about Senate Bill 99. And so just to that end, there's the rescue plan that came out, and then everybody, is tracking what might happen with the American Jobs Plan, which is going to have a lot of stuff specific to energy, climate, energy infrastructure, including water infrastructure, broadband. And then we know that California has a surplus that groups, including LGC and others, are advocating for using at least $1.5 billion of the $75 billion surplus on things exactly like this. What would your message be to regulators or legislators? Just a quick round robin. If there's one thing that you would want funding to be available for your peers to your peer cities or peer developers to do, what would that be? And that question's for all three presenters.
I think the initial sort of low-hanging fruit, funding is to allow for to plan, to really explore what this means for your community, right? Planning grants or stuff like that. Those are, they're typical, but there hasn't been a lot in this space. And I think this issue is could be kind of, people could be really hesitate to, you hear these types of large costs. I'm paying $500, $600, $1,000 to cities for legal costs. Come on, going to a city council and having a contract that's going to pay $750 an hour for legal. That any city, let alone a small city like us, right? So I do think that hitting that, I think there's a lot of room in that over the next year or 2 years to really plan well. I think so. I would push a lot of that, and allowing governments to take advantage of credit and so forth. It's all been for the private sector, and so how do we incentivize government to do some of these projects?
Great.
Yeah, Renee, if I could just add to that quickly, you really took the words right out of my mouth. I think the upfront planning and feasibility and project initiation and just sort of getting over that initial hump of championing a project from a local government perspective is huge, right? I have quite a bit of history in the tribal energy space, as we mentioned here, and the federal government and the Department of Energy has purposefully facilitated a lot of capacity building and front-end feasibility and project initiation work for tribal governments and others like that. And I think that's a really powerful tool to implement at the state and local level as well.
Great. Okay. So with that, we didn't get to all three, but we're at time. And so I want to thank everybody for participating on as guests, members, and presenters. We're going to take our best shot at answering the remaining questions and release them in a follow-up email. And so thank you to the city and all the partners for that. I do want to thank all of our members and just really encourage anybody that's interested in becoming a member to sign up so we can do more of these. And just thank you to this team and to the rest of the board and our staff that helped facilitate this and make this happen. So with that, we're going to close out right on time, and we'll talk to you all soon. So thanks a lot.